My guest tonight is Joachim Hagopian. He returns to the show to discuss his latest article, Western State-Sponsored Terrorism, False Flags Spreading, Islamophobia, Race and Religious Wars, and New World Disorder. Joachim is a West Point graduate and former U.S. Army officer. After leaving the military, he earned a master's degree in clinical psychology and worked as a licensed therapist in the mental health field for 25 years. He now focuses his attention on U.S. foreign policy, international relations, and the various intrigues of the deep state. His blog is American Empire Exposed. Joachim, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, Tim. Yourself?
Very good. Thank you for coming on the show again tonight to discuss this great article you wrote. It's very long, well, relatively long, 14,000 words, long for an article, but it covers a lot of ground, and you kind of connect the dots and provide an analysis of the various terrorist events or perhaps false flag events and geopolitical intrigues that are behind them. Going back for a few decades. How do you want to get into this topic?
Oh, well, we can talk about the Project for a New American Century. That kind of, I think, became the blueprint for the 911s that followed.
And that was the organization that I guess began in late 90s, 1997?
Yeah. It started in 97, and the actual report on the transforming American defense came out in 2000, the same year, of course, that Bush and Cheney stole their first presidential election, thanks to the Supreme Court and Jeb's state of Florida, his brother's state of Florida, that gave him the election illegally through fraud. But yeah, they were able to hijack the presidential executive office, and then they did their little number, and it's all written there in their Project for a New American Century. They wrote all, they specified what we need is a new Pearl Harbor, and that's what 911 became. Now we should actually go back to 1993. With the very first attack on the World Trade Center. Because that's really the predecessor to 9/11, the one that brought the Twin Towers and Building 7 down. So yeah, I guess that's probably even a better place to start, would be the 1993 World Trade Center bombing.
And that was the incident, I guess it was in February of that year. That's when there was a truck bomb placed in the basement of one of the towers. And it was revealed that it was a FBI sting operation, correct?
Sure was, yeah. The FBI was in control of that one, and they had an informant who had been an Egyptian military officer who was acting as their paid informant, Mr. Salem. And he was the designated infiltrator who was able to get into the group, this terrorist group, alleged, that was making bombs to take out key buildings in New York City. One of them, of course, was the World Trade Center tower. And he was very close to actually there was the plan for him to, instead of putting in explosive powder into the making of the bomb, they were going to put in a non-explosive powder that would, of course, have no effect on any kind of lethal damage. And just when it came time for him to slip in this benign substance into the bomb making, apparently someone in the chain of command in the FBI office of New York City called the whole thing off. And of course, we now know what happened. Shortly after that, the bomb did go off, destroying $500 million worth of damage in the World Trade Center building, and killed 6 people and injured over 1,000 people. And this gentleman, the FBI informant, Mr. Salem, was so shaken up by and grief-stricken over he felt responsible for it going off because he was the one that could have prevented it. And, but he was very upset and angry at the New York FBI office. And, of course, he had his FBI handlers, and one of them was a woman FBI agent who was saying, oh, well, they just don't listen. It was like good cop, bad cop, and she was the good cop trying to console him. He actually was really determined to take it to the FBI headquarters in Virginia, and so so I think it was the supervisor. I think his name was Ansari. Came to him and said, well, the New York office really wouldn't want it to go to Washington, so we're going to hold off on that. And so yeah, what it did though is because we know that it was involved centralized command, and something as major as this, of course, would have to be run by the top echelons of power in Washington, which include, of course, not only the headquarters of the FBI, but of course the President of the United States, of course. The President of the United States, 1 month removed, he left in January of '93, was none other than ex-CIA director and, the globalist of all globalists, outside of maybe Kissinger, was George H.W. Bush, 1 month removed from presidential office. So the whole sting operation was under his command. And so, yeah, he had everything to do with it, just like he had his part in the whole 9/11 and the Iraq war and all of the rest. So, yeah, that was the first one, and they got away with that because outside of an obscure article that was noticed by a few people, but not enough, obviously, on October 28th of 1993, New York Times, mainstream media, actually ran an article explaining that it was, in fact, an FBI sting operation that didn't go forward. And they quoted Mr. Salam in that article. And so, yeah, it came out, but then, of course, it didn't really make any kind of impact for any kind of follow-through. There was another one, and in all of these false flag operations, there's always insiders who are basically terrorists, but they're allowed to go scot-free because they're insiders. They work with the government, and therefore they want the ones that are closest to the government sources to be free and away from any kind of further recrimination or further questioning, further interrogation. So there was actually another terrorist involved who was able to go back to Iraq. Eventually, Saddam smartly put him in prison. A terrorist belongs in prison, and 60 Minutes was able to actually do an interview, and this is like I think in 2000, just before 9/11, and 60 Minutes did an interview, and they called it "The One Who Got Away." And it turns out that this guy was part of that sting operation, and then there's a quote in there saying, but he was so cooperative and handed over so many names and addresses that we let him go. I mean, this is how our government operates. They will, work with terrorists. They'll have their patsies, who are the ones that are, of course, blamed, but they're almost always dead after the so-called terrorist acts, and dead man can't talk. So that's their whole basis. And then they let other ones go because they're too close to the government. And, of course, the government wants to distance itself after every false flag to silence any kind of truth coming out about the government's involvement. And, in fact, the government is behind all of them. And so, yeah, that was a sad, sad run-up to the big 9/11. where they actually did destroy the World Trade Center and Building 7 as well.
And of course, in the 1993 case, the FBI took credit for cracking the case that in a plot that it itself had cooked up.
Yeah, they were able to hone in real fast on those culprits, and within a year, actually, they were tried and convicted, and they were given all this kind of accolades. Oh, such great work! Yeah, you're the insider that did it, so you better know about it.
And despite being complicit in the attack, no FBI agent was ever held responsible, indicted, much less even demoted for their involvement in it. In fact, they were probably promoted. Right. Yep. So, yep. In the article, you cite, going to motive here, I think you quote Ted Gunderson, the late FBI agent.
Renegade.
Yeah, there's still some question what his role in all this is, but that's a whole other podcast, I think.
Yeah.
But
he's surrounded by some controversy. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, because involved in COINTELPRO and all that stuff. So you can always wonder. But I guess he was the former director of the LA FBI field office. But he believed that the CIA and FBI are ultimately responsible for most terrorist attacks. But in the article, you say that in the 1980s, a DOJ attorney told him that anti-terrorism legislation would have to pass, but more people would have to die. People will have to be killed for this to pass, the official told him.
Yeah. One of the attorneys that authored the original Patriot Act way back in the 80s, this is how long in advance they had been planning basically the New World takeover of our democratic republic. They were stripping all the civil liberties away way back in the 80s. That's pretty amazing. And basically, this woman said, there's going to have to be more people dead before they ever pass this one. And then the litmus test became the World Trade Center bombing of 1993, where only a half dozen of human innocent lives were lost. And, it didn't go anywhere in Congress. So, her words turned out to be rather prophetic, sadly.
But then 2 years later, we have the Oklahoma City bombing, allegedly carried out by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols.
That's right.
Now, I think people who've researched that have blown pretty much blown apart the official narrative of that event.
Of course, yes, that was a huge false flag. Yes,
because the FBI's involvement in that was, of course, it had something to do with the PATCON program, which is Patriot Conspiracy. How they were infiltrating these militias and trying to stir up trouble throughout the country to justify. One thing to justify the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms budget and also their own budget, but also to marginalize these groups and to the politics of the mid-90s. These groups were gaining some traction with the criticism of the Clinton administration, and people who've looked into the Oklahoma City bombing found there was a whole lot of trouble with the official narrative, and that there's a lot of evidence of foreknowledge and their infiltration of Elohim City, and the mountain evidence that suggests that Timothy McVeigh was some sort of intelligence operative. And
he served in the first Gulf War, and he wasn't in intelligence, military intelligence, while he served. And yes, he was definitely, I believe, an FBI asset. CIA, FBI. He in very, very, very deep. And also was the second guy that got away too.
Yeah, the John Doe number 2, which they put an APB for, and just kind of disappeared down the memory hole. The fact that none of the videotapes that they had on Timothy McVeigh were used in his trial, because apparently there's some question whether it was he that rented the truck, and there's also the involvement of Straussmeyer, the German and Western intelligence asset.
Yep.
And so this was some sort of COINTELPRO operation, much like 1993. It looks like it was instigated, and one of these typical FBI sting operations that we've come to know and love in recent years that are that Trevor Aronson writes about in the Terror Factory, and that's what it appears to would have occurred there. But then that was sort of a strategy of tension there, where that was the pretense to get a domestic anti-terrorism law passed.
Yeah. What we have here is like we have the government has reined in on two major target populations. Obviously, this article I wrote is focused on the one, which is the Muslim. So it's a war on Muslim or Islam using patsies that are paid assets most often, I believe, of the intelligence forces. And then the other target population, of course, is homegrown domestic terrorism. And so they're going after, and that umbrage includes dissidents. You don't even have to be a plotter of some kind of terrorist act. All you have to do to be labeled in that big umbrella is be a dissident, disagree with the deep state, and you are being criminalized as a potential terrorist. And so we've seen this process unfold, particularly since 9/11. But in recent years, you know, they have interviews with the domestic Homeland Security secretaries, and they're all hyping it up. They're all saying, oh yeah, these domestic terrorists are more of a threat and danger to us Americans than those Muslim terrorists. I mean, they're you know, and it's obvious what they're doing. They've created and financed, trained, and blah 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 the Muslim terrorists for a long time. So they're not going to out them and say, yeah, they're the bad guy, because they're basically paid allies, mercenary, proxy war mercenaries. So they're using them for, you know, an instrument of chaos around the world for destabilizing the entire world, basically. And meanwhile, they declare war on anybody who disagrees with the totalitarian regime tactics, and declare them as potential homegrown terrorists, so they can all be locked up too. You know, so they basically, you know, make sure that they falsely accuse the two populations that unfortunately a lot of people don't get it. And sure, there are a few, probably a handful of you know, hardcore militia types that are so anti-government that they got their guns and they're ready for the battle and the whole bit. But you know, they so overplay it and over-exaggerate, you know, to make sure that they're able to, you know, convince the American population that their lives are in peril, and therefore we need more security. Like more security actually gets the results, because all we've seen with more surveillance and more authority in them to strip away all our rights is more acts of terrorism that they themselves do. So, you know, it's not working, obviously, and it's not working by design. But go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, you had a quote here by former CIA officer David Steele. He had this said during an interview regarding false flag events.
Yeah, actually, I have to correct that. His name is Robert David Steele. For some reason, my source only said David Steele, but his name is Robert David Steele. Yeah,
and he was a 20-year military career, a Marine Corps military intelligence officer and CIA officer. He says most terrorists are false flag terrorists, or are created by our own security services. In the United States, every single terrorist incident we have had has been a false flag, or has been an informant pushed on by the FBI. In fact, we now have citizens taking out restraining orders against FBI informants that are trying to incite terrorism. We've become a lunatic asylum, and that's what's happening. They aggressively recruit these people with money, blandishments, or even threats to get them involved in these supposed plots. The moment they can, get them to do something or get some sort of pretext for an arrest, they arrest the person and make a big show of it in the media.
Yeah.
And inevitably, it's always it was aspirational, not operational. So, as they always say about these attacks, so then because they never demonstrated real capacity for these people to carry out any attacks. So
Right.
they set them up. These people, whether it's at a mosque or these marginalized individuals, they have no money or something. They can get them arrested. And they did, it's not just Muslims. They arrested that guy in Ohio last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's one of these homegrown terrorists, I guess, that they talk about all the time.
Right.
But in the article,
yeah,
you talked
it's
about.
Interesting
Sorry, go ahead.
they take a CIA career guy and then the FBI director of the Dallas and New York and LA offices, both longtime career men in their respective intelligence fields, and they both are basically saying all these jobs are inside jobs by our own government committing these terrible false flag acts of terrorism. So I mean, to me, that's pretty strong evidence right there. Never mind looking at each case and see all the holes and the discrepancies from the official dialogue and the official narrative.
And the sad thing is that the judicial system, the courts, don't look at these cases and throw them out. They actually convict these poor people, throw them in prison for 20, 30 years.
Right.
In most of these cases. The judiciary has really dropped the ball, but then again, the judiciary is just part of the government, so what can you expect, really? So,
right.
But in the article, you mentioned going back to the World Trade Center in 1993, we mentioned Oklahoma City, but you also had the Balkan Wars in the 90s and the use of Al Qaeda as a proxy force in the 90s, and that served a lot of function there. How they destabilized the Balkans, particularly Yugoslavia, in the early 90s, the mid 90s, and that culminated in the 1999 war. But throughout that process, you had whether you had Al Qaeda forces or jihadist forces being recruited to fight that war on behalf of, Kosovo was breaking away from Serbia.
Yeah.
And
I think it's really important for Americans to realize how many years that our U.S. government has been employing Al Qaeda / ISIS or Daesh, whatever you want to call them. But they've been employing terrorists for many, many decades. It's now almost 4 decades long where we have created and employed on an ongoing basis every single decade since basically 1979 was the official term with Brzezinski and, Vice President to be H.W. Bush. They brought in Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden to fight Russia, the Soviets, in Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, and it was successful there. And then they continued it in the next decade in the Balkans to balkanize, break up from this major country called Yugoslavia that wasn't cooperating with the totalitarian push of our foreign policy. And that's what happens. Anytime a government stands up to American hegemony, they become the victims of usually some kind of either military or economic sanction threats to try and force them to succumb to the total exploitation, raping, I say all the time, raping and pillaging of their country using slave labor, if anything, and they destroy these countries. The World Bank moves in, the IMF, they get the countries in total debt. But this is what happens to the countries that cooperate. But those that don't cooperate, there's usually war in those countries. The CIA will make sure that there's war. There'll be overthrows, coups, assassinations. This is our foreign policy. And we use these terrorists as our proxies all the time. And we've been doing it now for a long time. So for over 20 years, by the time 9/11 came around, we'd been using these guys, the Al-Qaeda, as our little proxy terrorists. So of course, if you're going to use them as proxy mercenary war terrorists, you're going to also use them, in homegrown instances where, they actually commit acts of terrorism on U.S. soil. So that's what, in fact, happened with the 9/11 situation. And again, in 1993, where we were using them then, too.
Mm-hmm. And regarding Afghanistan, that was Brzezinski's plan in the summer of 1979, I believe early July of 1979, when he submitted the plan to Jimmy Carter to support Mujahideen or Islamic radicals in Afghanistan to lure the Soviet Union into a full-scale invasion.
That's right.
And so the narrative that many people thought was the Soviet Union, hungry for global conquest, rolled into Afghanistan on its way to Paris, I guess, or something. The Persian Gulf, maybe. Of course, that became the pretext for CENTCOM, right? And the Joint Reaction, Rapid Reaction Force. So the whole justification for the Rapid Reaction Force was based on a provocation orchestrated by Brzezinski, the Trilateral Commission CFR guy, Rockefeller, errand boy.
Yeah, he was a Rockefeller man.
Yeah. So much of, and of course there was a Rapid Reaction Force, which I guess would eventually become CENTCOM, I guess. And over there in the Persian Gulf. So again, it's one of these. It was all based on a false narrative, lies. The invasion was, one thing was to give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam, they destabilized the Soviet Union, and you've had efforts in the Caucasus and the Chechnya region with the CIA inciting, creating all types of trouble.
Right.
Of course,
the CIA is their agenda is to use the native population as terrorists to stir up trouble everywhere around the globe. I mean, that is their agenda. And if you want to go beyond that and look at every single war that America's ever fought, the false flag premise is always there. In every single war, it's a triggered, pre-planned event to get into war, and they always use false excuses to do it. And if you do your history, you find out every single war is a false flag event, just like every single act of terrorism is a false flag event. They're all orchestrated, pre-planned events by Western government, i.e., U.S. empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just was listening to a podcast talking about the troubles in Ireland and how most of the IRA attacks were British intelligence and military.
That's right.
And vice versa. It was at that level, they just wanted the troubles. They were the source of the troubles. It's a strategy of tension. And just now it's coming out.
MI6, the CIA, and of course, Israel's Mossad. Mm-hmm. Those are the trinity, unholy trinity of intelligence forces that have just done their dirty deeds around the globe. It's just horrible what they've done.
Yeah, I was just reading an article today about this. Is another side effect is apparently heroin use in the United States has quadrupled in the past.
Yeah, they're behind that too. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And they said since 2000, now what happened in 2001 that created this huge influx of heroin to the global market?
Yeah, right. We wanted to go after Afghanistan from the beginning, even long before 9/11.
And what was coming out of?
Of course, everybody knows about that. That little memo that our Wesley Clark got a hold of.
Yeah.
Take down 7 nations in 5 years. That was also part of the Project for the New American Century. Neocon clan put together that little plan to take down all those countries. Of course, Afghanistan and Syria and Somalia and Iraq, let's see, I think Sudan was one of them. They've gotten every single one except Syria and Iran, basically. They're still left on that list. And they're still in the crosshairs. The American government has not given up on getting rid of Assad, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, a thread you always see in this, I mentioned the heroin trafficking. Of course, in Vietnam, what was coming out of Vietnam?
That's right.
And that
the same thing there. Yes.
Yeah, the Golden Triangle, and of course, in the Central American wars, you had cocaine being shipped into the United States, particularly the South Central LA, and that's a whole other story with the Gary Webb and Ricky Ross and A lot of that money there, the money that was sold cocaine funneled back to the Contras at the same time, and also destabilized, much of the black community in the United States. And it's oddly enough, a lot of the money.
Get them hooked on the drugs. Yep.
Yeah, and then a lot of the money was funneled, was financed these rap recording companies like Death Row, which was used to further destabilize the communities. It really is an octopus when you're looking at this stuff, a tangled web when you're looking at all the connections. But it's fascinating and very disturbing. So we have that occurring but going way as far back as 1979, with stirring up a few Muslims, as Brzezinski called it, in that interview with the French newspaper. He said it was worth it. But another angle that you mentioned here is also just the rank profiteering we have here, is because all those that are perpetrating these crimes and engaging in these false flag events, they're all also cashing in. Not just the agencies themselves which are getting bigger budgets, whether it's the DoD, FBI, or CIA, or wherever Alphabet Soup agency is involved in this. But you mentioned Michael Chertoff. And he was in a very awkward situation back in the year 2000 when he was both spearheading Operation Green Quest, which was a multi-agency initiative investigating terrorist funding. But in the article, you say he was also defending a suspected terrorist financier.
Yeah, very notorious arms dealer who supplied the terrorists, Osama and company, the Al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. He defended him, got him off, and at the same time was heading this agency that was trying to find out how they fund these terrorists, and let's crack down on these sources here of the funding of terrorists, when the biggest funder of terrorism is the United States government. So who do they put into Homeland Security? This guy that has all these contacts to these terrorist arms dealers. So insane.
And then you have, of course, as the director of Homeland Security, he became, I guess, the second director of Homeland Security after Tom Ridge.
I believe he was.
But then he goes on, because he is his lobbying or his PR firm, Chertoff Associates, I think it's called, or he represented.
Something like that, yeah.
He represented the firm Rapiscan, which made these scanners, these radiating scanners that people have to suffer at airports now.
Right.
But then it was disclosed at the very time he was promoting their use as a government official, a former government official. He was also lobbying for their use because he's representing the firm that was ready to make a lot of money selling him to the U.S. government. In fact, they already had sold him to the U.S. government. But it was that incident with the so-called underwear bomber which justified their installation.
Right. He was having trouble with Congress, ratifying this deal, basically. And so he needed to come up with another terrorist event in the air, so he could sell his own, company, basically, making billions. And so what do? They come up with the underwear bomber. And that was a whole false flag event right there, where the Nigerian, young Nigerian Muslim, was basically planted with fake bomb in his underwear, apparently. And of course, it didn't go off, but they were able to get a whole public spectacle of this event where he's arrested there at the Detroit airport on Christmas Day. And it turns out that was just a plant, a false flag event, so that, they could, heighten up all the fear and the paranoia amongst the, because, since 9/11, there hadn't been any kind of air problem with terrorists in the sky. And so, of course, they wanted to resurrect this whole panic thing. And he gets to sell his equipment, the TSA invasive equipment that, radiates our bodies every time we travel.
And that was admitted, the U.S. government admitted to putting that person on the plane as some sort of, they admitted some sort of I guess, test operation or sting operation, but they admit to putting him on the plane with some sort of, I guess, flammable device in his pants. They admitted to doing that before Congress.
Yeah, it's very strong evidence that it was all, definitely a government operation. It was. I mean, thankfully there was one very astute witness that overheard a conversation with basically his handler at the airport, where the guy didn't even have a passport, and then he was granted access on board the planes, without a passport. It was basically a government operation from the very top.
Yeah, that was Kurt Haskell from a lawyer from the Detroit
That's right,
area.
very brave American attorney. Yes.
And if you ever want to look into that particular event, his testimony, and he has his own podcast show, I believe now. He has. You can find him on YouTube and various interviews where he goes into detail his experience, what he witnessed. A well-dressed, I guess you described it as a well-dressed Indian man.
Yes.
Putting him on the plane, this of course, the bomber himself was a son of a Nigerian banker or central bank official or something.
I think he was, yes.
A prominent family member, yeah.
He came from a family of means, definitely, yes.
So, yeah. Another example you cite is how Chertoff is now teamed up with Michael Hayden, former NSA director.
The NSA director during 9/11. Yeah, an insider. And they're partners now in their security firm, doing all this highfalutin consulting to the government, making millions and billions.
So they're out, stirring up, creating the mess and cashing it. Problem, reaction, solution, I guess.
That's right.
To cash in on it.
Yep, you can call them the Hegelianites or something,
So, if we were a nation of laws, instead of making hundreds of millions of dollars on government contracts, chasing phantom terrorists, they'd be charged for violating the Constitution and criminal statutes about surveillance, correct? Because they both admitted to crimes, both Keith Alexander and Michael Hayden.
Yeah, they are all treasonous because they actually created this enemy that supposedly kills innocent people. So they're treasonous. They're murderers for sure, but they're bringing down America. So they have committed treasonous acts. And I would go so far as to say that most of Congress has actually been treasonous in their behavior as well. We have a government right now that's full of traitors that have, made it their part of their agenda to actually take down America. And we have no bigger one than in the Oval Office. He's the biggest one of them all. And they all answer to the oligarchs or the so-called ruling elite. They've been in control for centuries of the Western civilization, and because of technology and their authoritarian control that they've been given because of these false flag terrorist events, they have more power now than ever, and they're moving towards the one world government. We all know that one too.
That's what all these wars are about, I guess, or destabilization that's occurring not just in the Middle East, but now apparently Europe with the migration crisis, which stems from the problems in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East.
Yes, it's all orchestrated, pre-planned events. You can bet that every single major event that goes on has been pre-planned. I don't know that if anything natural has occurred, and even here's the crazy thing. Even so-called natural events like disasters like hurricanes and things like this, they have these basically Tesla-like pulsar scalar weapons now that actually cause hurricanes and earthquakes and all of this too. So and weather modification and so we don't even, in droughts like in California, so we don't even know, these so-called natural events, we don't even know if they're actually not being caused by the government. In fact, I would venture to say that most of them are actually being caused as well by the government. So, it's pretty insane.
So, but again, with 9/11, in the article, you talk about who was involved in that. And one aspect of 9/11, which doesn't get a lot of attention, which I think you can make a good case for, is the Israeli involvement. We heard a lot about the Bushes and the Bin Ladens, and the fact that they were business partners, and how the Bin Laden family were flown out of the country in the week after 9/11. But
Right.
there's the Mossad connection here, which do you want to get into that a little bit?
Sure. I think basically what the neocons did is they handed over the operational aspect of 9/11 to Mossad, the CIA of Israel, and so they basically, we have all kinds of evidence of they took out a floor in one of the towers and were busily. This is like maybe 6 months in advance of 9/11. They had been busily stockpiling explosives, and of course we also, the truthers have one thing in common, even though there's a split on actually how those buildings went down and all of that. But the one thing in common is that it was a demolition. I mean, they went down in a demolition form. Now, the actual speculation of whether there was a scalar weapon involved too, to create the dust that Dr. Wood, Judy Wood, her camp basically says. And then there's the architects and engineers that are on the other side saying that the rubble was spread out over a larger area, and it wasn't like, just pure dust vaporized by some kind of scalar weapon, but it was a planned demolition. But anyway, what we have here in the Mossad is that they basically were able to be in charge of the whole operation of taking down the buildings, and so we have these van loads of Mossad agents basically driving away from the scene. Basically, they were in the process of trying to blow up. It was actually a much bigger planned event, that it wasn't going to just include those 3 buildings of the World Trade Center. It was also to blow up the George Washington Bridge, and they were going to be blowing up offices of the CIA, the Holland Tunnel was also involved in this. So thank God that the other planned events didn't get to happen. Actually, we're fortunate in that regard. But yeah, these Mossad agents were actually arrested. There were basically dogs that were able to sniff out their van, and there was evidence that actually there were explosives, residue powder explosives in the van that they were also documented. And yet, mysteriously, after being detained for a very short time, they were allowed to go free. Yeah, you have to wonder about that, because it was from the very top that they were allowed to be, go back to Israel. And then they were on a show bragging about their exploits. Pretty incredible. And then there was another incident, in Pennsylvania, where this is like probably 3 weeks after 9/11, and then these guys were picked up by local police in Pennsylvania, and then they were they discovered these videos inside their van of the Chicago Sears Tower, and zoom up close-ups of all that. And this is like 3 weeks after the World Trade Center towers went down. So they were held, and all of a sudden, the call to the headquarters in Washington, and they're free. So I mean, over and over, these guys that are part of Mossad, that were the real perpetrators of the actual operational aspect of the blow-ups, they were all allowed to go free. There was actually a group in Fort Leavenworth of 60 military officers, Army officers, who actually came out with a Washington Times article on September 10th of 2001, basically stating, CIA, you really have to watch them. They have the capability of being able to pull off events and make it look like it's the Muslims. And they actually came out with this article on the day before 9/11. And then, their prophetic words, there it is, within 24 hours. They actually did it, 9/11. And, so yeah, there's a whole lot of evidence. There's also evidence that Netanyahu, even before he became president, actually was meeting, and he's so deep in the Mossad and CIA that he actually had made statements that, we need to take down America and through some kind of false flag terrorism. So there's just a lot of evidence that the Israeli connection to 9/11, but a whole bunch of, they have their hand in almost all of it seems. They certainly were very steeped in the 3/11 Madrid train bombings. But yeah, their fingerprints are all over false flag terrorism, along with CIA.
By way of deception, right? So.
Yes, always.
So, but that was, I think you referenced, that was the Urban Movers. With the van with the emblem of the World Trade Center with a plane driving apparently. I think.
Pretty cryptic there, and you don't have to go too deep to get behind it either. And of course, the famous scene of them at the New Jersey park, jumping up and down, cheers as the buildings fall.
Yeah, that's when they did it on Israeli TV that they've been sent to film the event.
Yeah.
So foreknowledge.
Incredible.
Was it Michael Chertoff who got them released? The dancing Israelis?
It probably was. I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't certainly. I mean, he has the power, that's for sure. So, yeah.
And
he's, of course, one of the many neocon dual citizens that obviously has loyalty to Israel.
But the false flag MO with the Israeli intelligence goes even before the founding of Israel with the Stern Gang and the bombing of the King David Hotel. They originally tried to
1954 in Egypt. Yeah,
Havana Affair. And of course the USS Liberty, which you want to call that a false, US, which with U.S. government itself covered up, but more recently, I mean, I was reading Ari Ben Menashe's book, Prophets of War, and he claims the Achille Lauro was a Mossad operation.
I've heard that too.
Yeah, and Victor Ostrovsky, is that the guy who wrote the book? Another Mossad. He claimed that Kalash Jackal was a Mossad asset. The Mossad knew where he was all the time. I mean, really, from the standpoint of an intelligence or a military agency, you want these people going out and crazily creating mayhem, and because that provides a justification for your existence. So, really, it's not too hard to imagine why the Mossad would want occasional terrorists running around creating havoc, because that drives people into their camp, which is an old strategy. It's a strategy of tension.
Right.
And
the old, who's got both the motivation and the means, and Israel, they're guilty on all parts. That's for sure.
Just the Charlie Hebdo affair. What did Netanyahu say about that? His reaction was, "Come to Israel. All the Jews." You're not safe here.
Right. And the preceding event, oftentimes, with these acts of terrorism and quote unnatural acts of terrorism with the so-called disasters, so often, it's precipitated by some kind of move that Israel or U.S. empire does not agree with. The precipitating event that happened with the first Charlie Hebdo in January of last year was basically France recognizing a Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. We got to do something about that, and of course they were also moving to basically break with America on sanctioning of Russia. The sanctions of Russia have hurt European nations like France and Germany more than they have Putin's Russia. So, So that was another thing that pissed the power boys off, Israel and America, was those two things. And then within a month, bam, Hebdo.
Yeah. And yet you had the same. This brings us more recently to the November 13th attacks, and the same type of geopolitical jockeying seems to play here, because those attacks overshadowed what Putin was exposing going on in Syria with ISIS, correct?
That's right.
And also,
I mean, it's amazing how the timing of these events are so keyed into basically the geopolitical maneuverings that are going on at the time. Just prior, you want to look right ahead of the event, and you can figure stuff out real well. And obviously, the prevailing trends of the last Paris Hebdo attack, I'm not Hebdo, but Friday the 13th attack, was basically Putin stealing the thunder of Obama and his so-called war on ISIS. Where basically it was a fake war. We're there to protect them. They are, the U.S. empire's asset mercenary on the ground, and so since September of 2014, there was basically a lot of bombing going on, but the victims of the bombing were basically the infrastructure of Syria, including a lot of civilian casualties lost in that bombing. But the victims were not the so-called terrorists. They were protecting those terrorists, and then all of a sudden, September 28th and 30th, they're at the UN. Putin comes along and he outs Obama and his fake war against terrorism, and then takes charge in Syria at the request of the legitimate president of Syria, Assad, and so he starts taking over and exposing the whole oil, the pirated oil that's going to both Israel as well as Turkey, and of course we've seen the pictures that Russia released of the caravans of thousands of trucks daily moving from Syria right into Turkey, and of course we know how steep Turkey is in ISIS and terrorism as well, and then we have basically the Russian airliner being taken down on near Halloween, the end of October. 224 people, Russian people, dead suddenly, and they pretty much have discovered that it's more likely that ISIS may have been able to get access to the plane while it was parked docked in the Egyptian airport, and then of course it just so happens that Israel and America were both involved in a military exercise right very close to the Sinai where it went down, and then we know that with Friday the 13th, 2 weeks prior, on October 29th, actually the day before the plane went down over the Sinai, we know that Brennan was meeting with the counterpart CIA French intelligence director, along with Mossad, former Mossad director, along with a former consultant of MI6. So we know that this little conference was going on to basically plan for the Friday the 13th event that happened in Paris 2 weeks just prior to the event. And they also, and then we have right after, it was like happened on the Friday, and then Brennan was again interviewed on Monday as the Monday morning quarterback, and he's telling the press, he's saying, yeah, we knew, the intelligence community knew that there was going to be a terrorist attack in Paris, and then come to find out there's a judge that worked for security forces that had actually basically interrogated some probable terrorists inside France, and they had disclosed that there was this plan to go after concert halls in Paris. So they knew everything that was happening. They allowed that drive-by shooting of all those three restaurants. All those three restaurants in Paris. There was a span of about 11 to 12 minutes of just nonstop shooting as they're driving by all these different restaurants, killing, dozens more people. And come to find out, they knew that there was going to be an attack, and yet they allowed free reign where they're able to, drive by for all that length of time, never be stopped, and no cop in sight, and then on out, and then they eventually found it the vehicle a couple of days later. So, I mean, it's also very obvious that the government plays a part in every single one of these events. They get these patsies, they probably pay them, but certainly they're involved, and they have their CIA and Mossad and the French intelligence handlers that are able to work together with them to pull off these terrorist events where they kill hundreds of people. And it happens over and over and over. And until the populations of the West realize that it's their own government that is targeting and killing them, murdering them, their own government. They must realize this in order to then take up action to oppose what the government's agenda is, which of course is to strip away all rights, have an authoritarian, totalitarian regime where we have absolutely no legal rights, no representation, and the government can do whatever they want to the people. They can lock them up indefinitely. They can kill them at will, and there's absolutely nothing that the people can do because there's no rule of law outside of total chaos and murder and mayhem that's been authorized by all these terrorist events. So we got to do something before it's too late. That's why I write all these articles, trying to wake the sheeple up.
Of course, the mainstream media and the coverage of this, they're complicit in all this because at this point, I think anyone who does the research in these things realizes that the networks, the mainstream media has been totally infiltrated and controlled by the powers that be, the intelligence agencies, because the corporations that run these places are all part of the, I guess you could say part of the oligarchy. So we can't rely on the New York Times, or can't rely on CNN or Fox News or NBC, ABC, or CBS to do any reporting or, God forbid, any real investigating, asking any questions. They're just there to repeat the narrative, as court stenographers.
There's 6 oligarchs that control over 90% of all the information and news that's dispersed around the world. So that tells you, it's a very small group of people that are in total control of outflow of information. That's why the internet is so important. And, obviously under martial law conditions, they have their planned agenda to basically take down the internet and make it no longer accessible to the people. Well, we better fight that one too, because without the internet, we won't have any access or source of truth coming to us. We will not have it anymore.
Well, listen, we covered a lot of ground. The article I highly recommend. It's, again, Western State-Sponsored Terrorism, False Flag Spreading, Islamophobia, Race, and Religious Wars, and New World Disorder by Joachim Hagopian. Takeaway from this article is that everything is interrelated.